Welcome to the 12th episode of our show, Pakistan, a hard country, where we delve into the complex realities of Pakistan through the lens of Anatol Lieven's thought-provoking book.
And today we're really digging into it. Our focus is the 11th chapter, the Pakistani Taliban, specifically pages 357 to 389.
Yeah, this is a really crucial chapter. Lieven gets into how the Pakistani Taliban emerged, their ideology, the whole social context.
Exactly. He explores how they came about, what drives them, their core beliefs, and why they managed to get a foothold in certain regions.
So our aim today is to kind of unpack all that, understand their motives, their links to local people, and what it all meant for Pakistan back then.
Right. We need to look at who these groups really are, or were, based on Lieven's account.
Okay, so let's dive in. Lieven kicks things off with some important historical background, doesn't he? He mentions that militancy in those Pathan areas near Afghanistan.
Well, it goes way back, long before the Pakistani Taliban showed up. That's right. It's not a totally new phenomenon. He points way back to the early 19th century, to a figure named Syed Ahmed Barelvi.
Barelvi, okay, what's the significance there?
Well, Lieven explains that Barelvi and his followers actually moved into these Pathan tribal areas. They were looking for a safe haven.
A safe haven, why there specifically?
Because, according to Lieven, there was basically no effective government control there. It was outside the reach of the main powers at the time. So yeah, like at a safe zone.
Right, so a history of weak state presence, making it attractive for movements like his. And didn't Barelvi also, tap into the local culture?
He did. Lieven notes how Barelvi specifically leveraged the Pathans' reputation as fighters. He wanted to use their skills for his jihad against Sikh rule back in Punjab.
Ah, okay. So this establishes a pattern then, external groups finding refuge in recruits there.
Exactly. It sets a historical precedent. It shows that the region has been a place where outside jihadists could find sanctuary and, importantly, manpower. So the later emergence of the Pakistani Taliban wasn't completely out of the blue,
Got it. And then later on, you have the Durand Line drawn up in the 1890s. That must have complicated things, cutting through those tribal areas.
Absolutely. Lieven points out that while the Durand Line became the formal border on the map, the tribes themselves, well, they never really accepted it as a typical international boundary.
So they just carried on across it.
Pretty much. They maintained strong connections, kinship ties with people on the Afghan side. There was this shared identity that really transcended that line drawn by the British, this whole unique setup, geopolitical and social. It's crucial context.
Okay, so we have this backdrop. Historical militancy, weak state control, a border that wasn't really seen as a border by the locals. Against that, how does Lieven describe the Pakistani Taliban emerging? Is it just more of the same?
No, he definitely positions them as a more recent thing, a distinct phenomenon from those older tribal jihads. One key aspect he highlights is their relative discipline and endurance compared to earlier groups.
Discipline and endurance, where did that come from?
He partly attributes it to a network of local cadres, basically young local mullahs who provided the organizational structure.
Interesting. Young mullahs stepping up. That sounds like a shift in the local power structure itself, doesn't it?
It absolutely was. Lieven directly links the Taliban's rise to a major social upheaval happening within FATA, the federally administered tribal areas.
An upheaval? How so?
He argues the Taliban essentially helped these previously less powerful mullahs to challenge and often completely displace the traditional tribal elites, the landowning Maliks.
Right, the Maliks who used to run things.
Exactly. So the Taliban's arrival coincided with, and maybe even fueled, this internal power struggle. Seizing local power from the Maliks was fundamental to how the Taliban got established.
So it wasn't just some foreign ideology dropped in. It actively connected with local grievances and power dynamics.
Precisely. It tapped into existing tensions. And Lieven then looks at how they actually gained local support, which is fascinating.
How did they manage that?
Well, for instance, he mentions being in Bajor and finding that some locals didn't see the Taliban as the aggressors. They felt the Taliban were just, fighting back against the Pakistani government and army because they were being targeted first.
Really?
Sure.
And what about the fight against the Americans?
Yeah, some locals apparently even saw the Taliban as good people whose main goal was fighting the Americans over in Afghanistan, not causing trouble locally. It's a complex picture of perception.
That is surprising. How did the Taliban actually spread their influence to get that kind of view across?
Lieven describes it as a pretty quiet, gradual process. Lots of talk in hudras, those traditional Pathan men's gathering places, and also in the mosques.
So person-to-person persuasion?
Things like it. Starting small, often with local guys who'd been recruited elsewhere, maybe in Afghanistan or madrasas, and then came back to their own communities to spread the message.
It almost sounds like they filled a void then,
Hmm.
as the traditional Maliks who used to dominate economically lost influence.
That's exactly the contrast Lieven draws. The decline of the Malik's authority created an opening, and the Taliban, often through these newly empowered local religious figures, stepped into it.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Lieven takes us to Peshawar, the main city in the region, in the summer of 2008. What was the feeling there at that time?
He describes a really noticeable change. Earlier, maybe a sense of helpless drift, he calls it. But by summer 2008, it felt much more actively dangerous. Things had escalated.
Escalated how?
The scale of bombings, just unprecedented levels, hundreds of casualties. It was a terrifying period.
And Lieven notes a change in targets, too, right? It wasn't just going after the state anymore.
Yes, that's a crucial point. He observed a shift towards attacking soft targets, crowded public places like bazaars, even hospitals, not just military or government buildings.
That must have had a huge psychological impact.
Immense. It brought the violence right into the heart of civilian life in a way that felt indiscriminate and terrifying.
And around this time, there was also the situation in Swat getting worse. That was a big deal, wasn't it?
A very big deal. Lieven really highlights the Taliban's growing control over the Swat Valley. This was significant because Swat wasn't part of FATA, the tribal areas.
Right, it was part of the settled province, NWFP, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
Exactly. So it represented the militants moving out from the traditionally ungoverned areas and into the established territory of the province. It showed a real expansion of their ambition and their reach.
Wow. So amidst all this violence and expansion, Lieven also talks about the explanations people were coming up with, the conspiracy theories.
Oh, absolutely. It's quite striking. He recounts just how pervasive these conspiracy theories were, not just in Peshawar, but elsewhere too. People had all sorts of ideas about who was really behind the Taliban.
Like what kind of ideas?
Everything, really. He heard theories blaming American mercenaries, Indian Sikhs, Israeli agents. Even Russians, Chinese, Iranians were sometimes floated as the secret hand controlling the Taliban.
It sounds like they were blaming almost everyone except the Taliban themselves.
Pretty much. And it got even more extreme. Lieven mentions hearing a theory, reportedly from a lawyer, and even someone from Pakistan's Human Rights Commission,
Okay.
that the entire conflict, all the bombings, the fighting, was actually faked.
Huh.
Manufactured by Pakistan's own intelligence agency, the ISI, that the ISI itself was carrying out the attacks.
That's an extraordinary claim, especially coming from those kinds of sources.
It is. And Lieven argues these kinds of widely held beliefs had a real impact, especially among journalists.
How so?
Well, if journalists and their audiences widely believed these conspiracies, that it wasn't really the Taliban, but some hidden foreign or domestic actors, it seriously weakened public willingness to support military action against the actual militant.
Because why fight the Taliban if they're just puppets or if the whole thing's fake?
Exactly. It muddied the waters completely. And Lieven suggests this context helps explain why the army, later on, particularly after April 2009, made such an effort to try and, well, manage the Pakistani media narrative. They needed public support.
Right, so you've got this situation. Escalating violence, rampant conspiracy theories, shaky public opinion. How are the powers that be trying to handle it? What were the debates like in summer 2008?
Lieven describes a real tension, basically conflicting views, between the politicians and the military on how to deal with the militants.
What was the politicians' stance?
He paints a picture of them being kind of caught, scared of Washington pushing for action, but also scared of the Taliban themselves. This led to a lot of back and forth, policies swinging between launching military operations and then quickly trying to negotiate peace deals.
It must have driven the military mad.
Well, Lieven certainly describes their frustration. They felt they weren't getting clear, consistent political direction. And they saw their efforts, their gains on the ground being wasted whenever a truce was suddenly called, allowing the militants to just regroup.
Were there different ideas within the Pathan community itself about the best approach?
Yes, Lieven touches on that too. He contrasts the views of figures like Afrasiab Khatak from the secular Pashtun nationalist ANP party and Lieutenant General Masood Aslam, who was commanding forces in the region.
What were their perspectives?
Interestingly, both seem to agree on the vital importance of public opinion. They both stressed the need to somehow put the militants in the wrong, to delegitimize them in the eyes of ordinary Pathans.
But maybe differed on how to achieve that?
Somewhat. General Aslam emphasized using force, but specifically using it early, hitting hard, but also discriminately avoiding civilian casualties. However, he also understood the Pashtun culture, the expectation that you had to make genuine, honest attempts at talks before you resorted to force. You had to be seen to have tried dialogue first.
So a kind of culturally sensitive military approach almost? Force, but within certain norms.
You could say that. A nuanced understanding. And this leads to one of Lieven's main conclusions for this whole period, that both the Taliban themselves and also the Western media covering the conflict consistently failed to grasp just how critical Pakistani public opinion, and specifically Pathan public opinion within that, really was. It was a key factor shaping everything. Policy, events on the ground, everything.
So looking back at Lieven's analysis from that time, what does it tell us that's still relevant for understanding Pakistan? It feels like this incredibly complex mix: history, social changes, ideology, and this crucial factor of public perception.
Absolutely. I think the chapter really drives home how a lack of effective state control in some areas, combined with real socioeconomic frustration and that long history of resisting outside powers, how all that created, fertile ground for groups like the Taliban to emerge.
And those conspiracy theories, they highlight just how hard it is to counter extremism when there's so much distrust and misinformation, right?
Definitely. It makes building consensus for action incredibly difficult. And then you had the conflicting views: should we fight, should we talk, adding another layer of complexity to an already messy situation.
So Lavin's point seems to be that any real long-term solution has to grapple with these deep local realities. It's not just about military tactics, it's about understanding the context, winning hearts and minds.
Exactly. Especially the hearts and minds of the Pakistani people in those Pacific Pathan regions with their unique history and culture. That's the underlying message, I think.
So for you, the listener, hopefully this deep dive gives you a more nuanced picture than you might get from just headlines. It shows the deep historical roots, the tangled social threads that contribute to these complex situations.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What other questions does this raise for you about Pakistan's future, or the challenges of tackling extremism anywhere, really?
Maybe you could consider things like what's the role of education or economic development in these regions? And also, how might outside actors, even with good intentions, sometimes make these complex internal dynamics even worse? Lots to think about there.